It is International Day of Persons with Disabilities.
And one organization is drawing attention to the plight of those, especially children, who do not have assistive devices like wheelchairs, hearing aids, and even nappies.
Well, joining us this morning here is Therina Wentzel-Du Toit. She's from the National Council for Persons with Disabilities. Therina, good morning and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a huge challenge. This is just reading your press release about the issue of assistive devices, particularly for children. It looks like as a country we're not really doing well.
We're not doing very well. I must admit there are about 3 provinces that's doing well, and I think we need to praise them.
Which provinces?
That would be Limpopo province, and Gauteng is not too bad, although not great. And then Western Cape, they're not doing badly at all.
Okay, so Gauteng, Limpopo and the Western Cape seems to be leading the way. Let's start there on the good news, because we always need the pockets of excellence to encourage and inspire us. What are they doing right?
Well, when people with disabilities are in hospital, either through an acquired disability, like after an accident or a situation where there was a gang fight or something like that, then obviously they need to be discharged with an appropriate wheelchair or an appropriate assistive device or whatever. And this must not just be a one-size-fits-all. The person needs to be evaluated properly. And also when there's an injury during birth or somebody's born with a disability, it's normally just only later when the person is no longer a baby, or very early for people with hearing loss, for example, the identification of hearing loss. And then people are not supposed to be just sent home for some clever person or a neighbor or a person of religion to identify that there's a challenge and then send them back. And in terms of those provinces, it seemed that they really track people, they know what people need, they do proper evaluations, and the end result is an appropriate assistive device, not a one-size-fits-all, because that can aggravate the disability again. But
why are we seeing that? Why are we seeing that healthcare workers in some places are aware and know to service that need, and in other places, is it a matter of training? Is it a matter of identifying what the need is after the scenarios that you've explained, or is it just a disinterest?
Yeah, I don't think there's any challenge in terms of knowing what the need and what the challenge is. The challenge is out there, and people like ourselves and individuals and other organizations, they really bring it to the fore all the time. I think in some instances it's a matter of lack of budget. And it's also a lack of caring. It's also not enough political will from above. So if there's no political will from above and it's not stated as is, then obviously there will be no delivery lower down the lines.
So you've highlighted what you call the under-provisioning of these assistive devices across the country, although Gauteng, Limpopo and the Western Cape are doing slightly better, but I guess the problem is really national. Okay?
It is national.
What is the impact that under-provisioning has on children particularly?
Well, first of all, we say children is our future, but then if we don't give them an appropriate assistive device, how can they be educated? They can't be included in schools. If it comes to something like nappies, that's why we do a huge big nappy run every year. If a child doesn't have a nappy, it's a small thing, and it sounds like we're making a noise about something so insignificant like a nappy. But anybody who's raised a child will know that it's an expensive item. If you don't have a nappy, you can't drop a child at school. It's a dignity matter. It's also a health issue, and it's a matter of social acceptance and health.
Now, you also talk about schools or centres that cater to children with disabilities, saying that they are in desperate need, and you would wonder that these are centres that are specially set up to deal with children with these special. How can it be? And you say that they are failed by government, so what needs to be done now?
Most of these centres actually are set up by concerned community members, and sometimes parents, carers, but other community leaders. And then there's a whole process of trying to get them registered with authorities, whether it's social development or Department of Health, in some cases even education, which is the right place. But then it doesn't mean they get resourced. Then government would say, this is what you have to do, this is the minimum standards. They put pressure. There's now a new policy being developed to put even more pressure on such little centres to comply with what government wants, what is minimum standards. But then who resources them? So it's mostly community again, NGOs, and there's pockets where government does help a little bit. For example, again in the Western Cape, they do support these little centres. But again, another thing in the Western Cape, a child who needs a hearing aid, for example, they only get one hearing aid. So it doesn't matter if there's bilateral hearing loss, and people wearing hearing aids where there's the challenge on both sides will realize that one hearing aid already it's a challenge, you know, because it doesn't resolve the problem, but it even aggravates it if you're struggling in that respect.
I mean, constitutional, I think Section 27 of the Constitution, I think
Yes,
under
yes.
that the government is
Exactly.
obliged, it's got a constitutional obligation to make sure that those rights of the people with persons with disabilities are not undermined in any way, shape or form. Your view, with experience you have as an organization that deals with persons with disabilities, what would you advise government to focus on? Earlier you mentioned budgetary constraints, maybe in some of the provinces. What else do you think they should focus on to get it right?
I think there's a scenario with government where they're encouraging a lot of small little NGOs and initiatives to see the light, where people do not have the ability, and it shares the resources very broadly, instead of rather taking that money and making a difference to the real people, instead of funding infrastructures, you know, new infrastructures. With that, I'm not saying NGOs should not be funded. I'm just saying there's loads and loads of people, but if you fund an infrastructure just halfway, it doesn't really help to empower that infrastructure to empower people. And I want to give 2 or 3 examples very quickly, if you allow me. With regards to children that are raped, for example, and we're also in the 16 days of activism period at the moment. Children who are raped is a disaster, but if it's a vulnerable child with a disability, resources immediately has to come into play, because our systems, our justice system, for example, even our police system and the courts, they are not au fait with what it is to really assist and make sure that the child gets access to justice. And there's resources needed. What I mean by resources is, for example, a child who cannot speak in court but is cognitively okay to give evidence. There's some equipment needed, there's people power needed to make sure the child gets justice. I want to mention another example. Last week we were devastated when a little boy, it's a boy who had epilepsy, was left alone. He fell in a fire. He then lost his one arm and on the other hand fingers, and his face was deformed and all that, and it was clear that the mother can't look after the child properly and that she drinks a lot. And immediately we as an NGO, we got involved, we helped where we could. The child was hospitalized. The mom helped the child to get well. She stole the child out of hospital, and she was just after the grant and all that, and eventually last week the child died. And I feel the mom and the system and everybody failed the child, because we immediately went to Department of Social Development and we had a family member that was prepared to immediately take the child with or without the grant. But the child was failed by the hospital, by the Department of Social Development, and obviously then by the parent.
It's very tragic. There's a lot of work to be done. But thank you very much, Therina, for coming in
and
to
highlighting these,
and highlighting some of these on
we
today,
appreciate for having us here.
which is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities.